Hello and welcome to Future Proof Mzansi, a podcast where we discuss how consumer behavior shapes our marketing plans. I'm Sena, your regular host on this podcast, and today I am joined in studio by William Stubbings, a colleague of mine at Kantar. Welcome, Will. I'm really excited to have you in the driver's seat today. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself and explain your expertise?
Sure, thanks, Sena, and thank you very much for having me. My name's Will. I've been with Kantar for about 8 years in the consulting business. I'm now a client partner, and I've been heading up our sustainability practice from a South Africa perspective for about 3 years.
Excited to have you here, Will. Last year, we had a fantastic discussion with Heineken about the role of marketing and helping people live more sustainably. But we only really scratched the surface, and we knew we would have to do another episode on this very topic. So it just happens that the 15th of March is World Consumer Rights Day, and the theme of 2025 is a just transition to sustainable lifestyles. This year, the focus is on how it's essential that sustainability and health choices for consumers are made more available, accessible, and affordable. Not only that, you and I also hosted a webinar at the end of January about how creativity can save the world and bring sustainable living to life. And only 7% of the attendees who responded to a poll on that webinar said that they were doing just fine in communicating sustainability to their consumers. Only 7%. Did that shock you?
Not really, but I have been in this space for a while. There's a long way to go.
So obviously it felt like the perfect timing to really get back in studio and discuss the pivotal role that marketing can play in building a sustainable future.
So we're very lucky to have someone to help us explore this topic today. With me in the studio today is Marina. Marina, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you're about?
Thank you very much. I think warm MTN yellow. Yeah. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Yes, we have our own language and our own greeting.
So yellow's my favorite color, by the way. I know that's relevant, but I just, immediately happy.
That's awesome. No, that's exactly the reason we chose the color. So I think for me, I'm really, I'm the executive for sustainability and shared value at MTN. I've been there for about 6 years. And you've invited me to talk about one of my favorite topics about how consumer behavior is actually shifting and how sustainability is influencing it. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on to Future Proof Mzansi. So before we get started on your favorite topic, as you've said, we'd like to know a little bit more about you. We always started off with asking something about our guests, a little bit quirky, a little bit something that no one would know in the industry. So as a starting point, just tell us how you came to this role and also what sparked your passion for sustainability.
Yeah, so to tell you something not a lot of people I would say know about me is that I'm actually terrified of heights, but I'm willing to conquer my fears. So I've gone bungee jumping off Victoria Falls and so forth. I believe you should, and I'm planning to go skydiving later on in this year.
Wow.
So yeah, confront your fears. Is the lesson there. So I think for MTN, as I mentioned, I've been 6 years in this role. What's interesting is that my whole entire life, I've always wanted to make a difference and an impact in society, in communities, and so forth. So when I was called upon to join MTN, I was like, wow, what an amazing company. What amazing brand, what a great and extensive reach the company has. So I kind of took it upon myself that by joining, I'd be joining a company where I can, leave a legacy and make a difference ultimately across the continent.
Thanks, Marina. I honestly can say that your passion is honestly just exuding off you. So it's not just the yellow. Yeah. The passion is sparking a lot of joy right now. So normally my co-host and I will ask a few questions, but Will, interestingly, today, you are also an expert on this subject matter. So I'm going to ask you a little bit more about yourself, since you've been working at Kantar for over a decade and have seen a lot of changes in the marketing space. Could you tell us how brands have adopted to an increased focus on driving sustainable messages?
Well, firstly, it hasn't been a decade. It hasn't been that long.
It's okay,
but it has been a while. I'm coming to terms with my middle-agedness.
You don't look a day over 20.
Oh, stop. I think, the sustainability space is extremely interesting. And I think what I've found great about it is that there's a really strong intersection with marketing as well. According to Project Drawdown, actually 25 to 30% of the emissions reductions we need to maintain 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels can be achieved through changing household habits. So that's things like switching your diets or trying to waste less or trying to use less water and energy. So daily habits, the things that marketers really do influence, have a huge, huge part to play. I think brands are more and more starting to realize this. We do see a lot of our clients still operating in the ESG space, which is a regulatory space to be in. And that's really, really important. But what we really like to help our clients do is translate that strategy into something that involves consumers. And we really think that businesses, governments, and society need to work together in order to solve these problems in a holistic way.
Well, and I think that's interesting because the theme this year is World Consumer Rights Day, and it's focusing on a greater protection and empowerment for consumers. But it's really also focused on the transition to a sustainable lifestyle and highlighting that it should not be at the expense of people's basic rights and needs. So I think this aligns well with what we spoke about in our recent webinar. Could you give our listeners a quick overview about what Kantar says brands should be doing to help consumers in their journey to being more sustainable?
So our webinar was developed in conjunction with the WFA, who Kantar partners with globally. And they've developed a brilliant piece of thought leadership called Sustainable Marketing 2030. And one of the capabilities that they believe marketers have that can help change the world is creativity. Creativity in marketing communications has always been there to grab people's attention, to teach them something, and ultimately to influence their behavior. That's in essence what marketing is there to do. We can't necessarily say that marketing has been influencing behavior towards the right things up until this point, but it is starting to realize that in order for marketing to really survive as a profession and to elevate itself in organizations, it needs to do something more. And our webinar was about creativity into action and how marketers can use those creative skills to tell compelling stories that can help drive behavior change towards sustainable outcomes.
And well, on that behavior change, this is what I thought was a fascinating stat from our sustainability sector index. And the stat is that 96% of respondents said that they want to live a more sustainable life, but only 10% were actively changing their behavior. What is causing the gap? What can you bring down this gap to?
So there's a couple of things, right? The one, a really simple one, is that there actually aren't that many solutions available to consumers that can actually help them live sustainably. The other is that sustainability often feels like a really abstract concept that's happening far away to someone else. You know, if you're watching a video of the polar ice caps melting and you're a South African, that doesn't feel like an urgent problem, right? So a lot of the issues or a lot of the barriers are around this idea of like abstraction, something happening way out in the future, when I actually have problems today. You know, I've got to put food on the table, I've got to get to work. You know, I need to save money for data because it's expensive. And, you know, I need to get my day-to-day life together. And often these problems just fall down the priority list in emerging markets such as ours.
Yeah, in fact, I've heard on the internet people call it first world problems, just again highlighting how it's seen as an issue, or it's at least being marketed as an issue that's sort of premium, you know, very niche, nice world problems to have. So I think that perfectly illustrates your point.
So I'm interested to hear from your perspective, Marina. What are some of the areas in which you guys focus, and what are some of the things that you're most proud of?
Thanks for that, Will. I think from an MTN perspective, when we think about sustainability, operating in this African context and the emerging market that you described, for us, we almost have this premise, and you know, in marketing, they call it almost like the key premise or sort of hook would be around doing for tomorrow today, because we recognize that a lot of the work we do is not necessarily about just today alone. It's actually more doing things for the generations that are to come. And so MTN has a 4-pillared sustainability strategy around doing for planet, doing for people, doing it right, and doing for growth, because we recognize that it isn't, in a lot of, other countries, there's a huge focus on environment, but we actually see that, the S of ESG is huge on the continent. When people start to speak about ESG, I often try and set a very clear distinction to say it's actually about the sustainability of a business, not so much about ESG. ESG is simply how you measure it, not necessarily what you're striving to do. And that's a clear distinction for us at MTN. And I think one of the other things that was very important for us was really the commitments we make, because it doesn't help that you say you want to do things for generations to come, but then you're not willing to have your words match your actions. So we put very deliberate commitments in place. I'll speak about three. One was to achieve net zero emissions by 2040. What we recognized is we had a moment where we sat and we looked at our subscriber numbers, and they were growing, like more and more subscribers. You can imagine post-COVID, you had even more data users and so forth. But we also saw that our emissions has been increasing along with our subscriber numbers. And so we started to say we need to actually put a peg in the ground and actually reduce the emissions. So we set a target 10 years earlier than the rest of the sector. And every day it is something we strive to live. So the decisions we make in terms of the kind of sites we put in, we take renewable into consideration, we take energy efficiency into consideration, so that our words match our actions. The other is that if you look at majority of the populations across the African continent, 50 to 60% of the population is women. So surely our organization should reflect society. So we then set a gender parity target that by 2030, we're going to have 50% women in the organization. I'm very pleased to say that, again, we did not look at these as just commitments, but put actions to it. We're actually sitting at about 41, 42 now, and we are continuously growing. So for us, it's really about those commitments, and it's about making decisions that are based off the reality of where you operate, but also that you reflect society within your organization and what you do outwardly as well.
I think that's pretty remarkable, because one of the things Will touched on in the webinar is sort of consumers being mistrustful of brands and accusations of greenwashing. So I think what you're talking about here, in light of our findings with the Brand Inclusion Index, where MTN came up as actually one of the most inclusive telco brands across Africa, is indicative of that. So kudos to MTN.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really just a comment. I mean, it's really important groundwork that you guys are doing there, because what we find is that, consumers will hold you responsible if you're making sustainability claims. You've got to have your house in order. So if you were to play a role in gender-based violence or inclusivity in the workplace more broadly, consumers would want to know that you have parity in your own organization. Otherwise, what's to believe?
Yeah. And what's interesting is that, people sort of think you're paying lip service, but you're right that they do look at what are you doing specifically. It was very interesting. We got a random letter from an organization I won't mention, but a very huge sporting entity in South Africa. And they said, we see what you're doing for the women in your organizations. Come and help us. And that was an example of gender pay in sports.
Yeah.
And that was simply just because we're doing gender pay. They were like, come help us address this issue of gender pay.
Yeah, I know, and I love, I'm going to talk about rugby because I know you guys do sponsor the rugby and it's my favorite thing.
Yeah.
I think, rugby didn't necessarily have the most inclusive image in South Africa for a long, long time. But when you actually look at the team now and how transformed it is, there's no one who's not there on merit. And there's no leader that's in place there that's like, none of them are permanent. So Sia's off the field a lot of the time and Eben steps in. The best thing about it is that in a rugby team, there's a shape and size body for every position. And on the rugby field, you're there to fulfill your role, and it's about pulling together as a team. And I think it's, just a really good example of how quickly South Africa can transform when it sets its mind to it. So good luck to you.
Thank you.
And also another comment I have, and I think it's very important, brands are quite skeptical of venturing into the inclusivity space, into, sustainability. And one of the things that they say, or one of the reasons cited, is we're afraid of the backlash. And I think by holistically implementing that strategy, going inside out, is so important in mitigating that. Because what I always say to the brands is that, especially in this digital age and in an information era, people will gather those receipts if you are being insincere. So I want to go to now communicating the sustainability message. Marina, I wanted to ask you, what do you think is in it for consumers, or how do you communicate the message? How do you communicate the category benefit, but also the sustainability benefit to your consumers?
Thank you for that. I think what's interesting in the work that we did with Kantar, particularly in the research, so Kantar assisted us with research, which for me, in this sustainability space, I tend to look for research. A lot of it was Europe, US, and there's pockets of excellence in South Africa on that research. But I found Kantar was unique in that it brought in the South Africa, but the rest of Africa also voice, including Ghana, Nigeria, and so forth. And what was interesting was that consumers don't just want to hear from brands and know that brands are doing the right thing. They actually want brands to involve them in their campaigns and in their efforts, which I thought was really remarkable. I think there was even a comment made that said, consumers, what they get involved with, how the things they purchase becomes a reflection of them. So not a reflection of the company, but a reflection of them. So I think for MTN, when I look back at a lot of the campaigns we've run, a few stand out. Wear It For Me is one of them. I don't know how many of you will remember that in the middle of COVID, we started seeing, practical, World Health Organization and so many organizations were hitting us with so much information at the time. It was like, wash hands, do this, wear masks, do this, do that. And I think for MTN, at that time, we had a really strategic partnership with the African Union around getting vaccines to health workers and to the general population. And we know that, the Western world had taken majority of the vaccines, that there were barely any left for us because we obviously couldn't pay to the same extent that they could. And so at that time we said, no, African Union, Africa CDC, let's join forces and create a campaign that's basic in messaging, not mixed message, as simple as wear it for me. And the concept was really around wear it for your mother, wear it for your child, wear it for everyone. You're not doing this just for yourself alone. And I think that really showed how, you can take something that's anchored in marketing, but put a call to action that follows actual action. And we saw it. We saw government coming out saying, I want to stand for wear it for me. We saw civil society organizations. Everybody came to the party, and you could see that behavior change. Another one that we run is really around gender-based violence. And I think, again, Kantar's research showed not only at country levels, but also at different generational levels, that there are different things that they prioritize, from job creation, gender-based violence, and so forth. You actually start seeing that they want brands to support such causes. And so for us at MTN, that's something that's so important to us, but we don't just want to talk about gender-based violence. I think everybody knows about it. We want to make it practical and say, okay, are you aware of anyone? How can they get help? How can you be an enabler to get help? And one of the key things that we also run is like a relationship test. And we say, answer that questionnaire and see whether you could be in a relationship that maybe you just aren't conscious of. Yeah. If you actually speak to a lot of women that are GBV survivors, they actually say they were not conscious that that they were in an unhealthy relationship. Sure. So by doing those kind of tests, encouraging people in your household, in your broader community to do such tests, really starts to say, how do you move from consumer-facing campaigns to behavior shifts. And I think that's fundamental.
Sure, that's huge. Love those examples. I think they were so personal, and they targeted specific behaviors, which is making all the difference. I think where marketing still gets it wrong today in the sustainability space is that they're in that old paradigm of talking about themselves and what we do. And in the sustainability space, that can translate to we've reduced our energy footprint, we've reduced our water, but what have you actually helped the consumer do? Because the consumer wants to live a sustainable life. And if you can help them practically and simply, you're doing an amazing job.
And Will, this is where I'm going to take the conversation back to you, because we saw that our Brand Z data showed that even sustainable brands are losing consumers on the path to purchase. And we can sort of narrow that down to many reasons, but another one is like affordability. Sustainable products, brands have this issue of being seen as premium or niche. So how do we then tackle the message that sustainability, it doesn't have to be something this exclusive, expensive thing to adopt?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in what you've said there. I think what we found in the Brand Z data is that while your sustainable marketing can predispose a consumer, they might come into a store to buy you, but then they might choose another product while they're at the shelf or while they're online. And that's because the day-to-day practical realities matter, right? If it's the end of the month and you've got to make ends meet and you've got to choose between like data or bread, you're going to have to make a decision there, and it might not always be the one that you want to make. I think we can all relate to the fact that we have to make compromises sometimes. But I think, what's important is that when you're developing a product that you want consumers to engage with from a sustainability perspective, the sustainability benefit alone is not enough. And that's quite a cold, hard truth. And maybe if you turn the spotlight on yourself, you're a consumer as well, right? You don't always make the best decisions for the planet. You don't always make the best decisions for yourself. So you've got to stack the benefit with a known category benefit. Like Patagonia is the example that gets bandied around a lot, right? And they do a lot for the environment. But you pay an arm and a leg for a garment from there, right? So you're paying for something that'll last long. It's a high quality product. And by the way, it's also known to be really sustainable. So, you look cool in your Patagonia sweater as well. So you can't forget that the basic principles of delivering a product or a service to market still matter, but you've got to add to that a sustainability agenda that matters. So that's hard. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, but that's what it's going to take. And if we don't do that, I mean, the downside is a lot worse than what it would take for us to innovate into a new sustainable kind of lifestyle.
And I think what you're highlighting on is probably why some brands may not be able to resist the trap of maybe greenwashing. And I'm going to speak to greenwashing a little bit, because it is the sort of elephant in the room whenever we speak about sustainability and how brands factor into that. Will our WFA Sustainable Marketing report with Kantar showed that 82% of respondents agreed that companies need to be braver in communicating their sustainability efforts. But how do brands strike that balance of being brave in their comms and also ensure that they're not being accused of greenwashing? And to also add that, we saw in our brand inclusion index, some of the themes that came up was that consumers want brands to take a stand, but consumers are frustrated because brands are falling short of that.
So greenwashing is, it's a scourge. It's obviously undermining the good efforts that brands are doing in the space, and it's really difficult to cut through the noise when there's so much cynicism in consumers. But it's healthy cynicism a lot of the time. I think what brands need to consider is what they're being held accountable for. Like, what is the stuff that you need to get your own house in order before you start trying to save the world? You've got to start with yourself. It's a company-first mindset. What are we accountable for? What are the problems we're creating? What is the role we can play in alleviating them and then doing stuff better? So it's often easy to get seduced by the latest trend or what's in the media at the moment and go for those kind of shiny objects. But you've got to do the hard work first. You've got to start making sure that you as a business are doing the right things. And if you can do that, you're coming across authentically. Then you can start playing in those more, more topical spaces. We've spoken about ESG a little bit earlier. I sometimes feel like the G is the one that gets kind of left off. People go ESG and kind of like forget about the governance part. And I'm just interested to hear what you at MTN do to address the G.
Yeah, so very interesting that you say that. And it is true. And the essence of it is doing the right thing. That if you summarize the G, that's the essence of it. I think if you look at the emerging markets context, South Africa, Nigeria, and a whole lot of other African countries, the biggest thing when everyone looks at us is they automatically assume high levels of corruptions, high risk. I mean, I speak to investors all the time, and you can tell they won't outright say it, but that is a concern.
Yeah.
So I think the G, for us as you know, as Africans, we need to note that what's the landscape we're playing against, but also. For me, I feel like the G is a bread and butter matter.
Yeah.
You simply monitor risks like you would anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
You ensure anti-corruption, anti-fraud practices like you would anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
So I think for me, the G is often not spoken about simply because it's the right things you should be doing in any case. It's not unique in any way. And that's why I said from ESG, in an African context, everyone's living out the S. You know, the G you should do in any case, irrespective. You should always act with integrity, behave in an ethical manner. Those are just a given. So I think that's probably why it's not spoken about. And also it depends on who's looking, you know?
Exactly. Which stakeholder group.
Yeah.
I find it amazing, like half the world voted last year, half the countries in the world. And if you look at how tumultuous all of that was, not just in America, but in Europe, and all of the like geopolitical tensions that are popping up, polarized populations. South Africa's gone the other way. You know, maybe we've gone through our dark past. We went to a government of national unity. We got together, we got around the table, and we actually responded to issues that are definitely driving people apart. We know we're an unequal society in South Africa in particular. But we're prepared to go to join forces and start trying to work together. I feel like it's a very hopeful space for South Africa in particular to be in at the moment.
And I think this, speaking on that and drawing on the global context, Will, I think this would be a good time to also address another elephant in the room, which is the current sort of discourse happening around the world, especially in the US right now, with companies backsliding on their climate and DI agreements. South Africa is very different, of course, as you've pointed out, Will. But Marina, I'm interested to hear what your sort of message would be to companies in Africa and South Africa trying to make a change in the context of a more anti-sustainability, anti-DI climate.
Thank you. I think this is probably a question I am asked now almost every 2 to 3 days. And the developments in the US has obviously not helped the sustainability movement. And I think companies should not dismiss it. So in no way do I believe we should just say, it's isolated to a certain part of the world, it's a reality only for them and so forth. I think we need to put it on the table. We need to unpack what is it that is being challenged to understand it properly. And that's what I would encourage companies to do. To understand also what lies behind it, and then what implications does that lead towards the African continent. If you look at the DEI particular movement, a lot of it is centering around American history. And if you look at around minorities and what's happened with Black Lives Matter and so forth, you started to see a lot more companies doing things after that movement. And then now the regression that's happening and the debate is like, let's undo those. And so I think for me, the question any company should ask itself was, is diversity and inclusion important to your business? Is it the right thing? Then Black Lives Matter won't be the thing that shifts you to do something. Yeah. You will do something because it's the right thing to do. And I think even ourselves, we're sitting and unpacking it for the board right now, and conveying the message that at the end of the day, the reason why we have gender parity targets, the reasons why we have a net zero target, wasn't because there was a movement in the US about it. It was because it was the right thing to do. You know, we want to reflect society, as I've said. We want to do our best for the environment. You know, so I think if every company sits and tests the why, if the why doesn't make sense, then change. But if your why makes sense, stay the course. And so I think that's a lot of what we need to sort of get down to it. And I think for a long time, this ESG movement and the naming, as I mentioned earlier, was really, it arose out of investors predominantly trying to quantify the non-financial risks related to a business. They didn't know how to do it. They kind of would say, okay, let's measure corruption index, let's measure this and that, and they couldn't quite, put their fingers to it. And that's how ESG really was born, was out of that. But sustainability always existed. The importance of sustainability is actually growing even more right now because of this polarized world we're living in, these geopolitical developments and all of that. They pose greater risks than ever before. We've never seen the world to the state that it is right now. And if we're going to brush aside conversations around women, brush aside around, inclusion, elements like that, I think we need to question, the company needs to question purpose, motives, and all of that. Because I think for us, we've seen it simply makes business sense. And I think from a brand perspective, very interesting that brand finance obviously does the measurement of brands across, obviously, South Africa largely. And what they've done over the last 2 years is actually to put, of the total value of a brand, how much is related to sustainability. So there's a sustainability perception value that's associated. And as MTN, we're extremely proud that, we had one of the highest sustainability perception value, which I think in the first year was about 11%, in the second year was about 9%. So it's like 11% of the brand last year was as a result of the sustainability perception. So that shows that sustainability is contributing not only from a brand perspective, but also from a customer choice perspective. Customers are choosing brands that are responsible. Yeah. Employees are choosing companies, whether these companies are sustainable or not. So it's far beyond just looking at it from an investor lens. It's quite holistic, and we experience that every day.
And if I can just comment on that, because I literally got chills as you said that whole thing. We see that, for example, the generation coming up now, Gen Z, data from our Brand Inclusion Index really shows that their perceptions of diversity, inclusion, sustainability affect their purchasing decisions. It's very intentional, not just occasionally, but all the time. And one of the things that we see also with Gen Z, this generation coming up, is that they're the most ethnically and culturally diverse generation ever. And as they grow up, they will begin to take a larger market share. So I think for commercial reasons, it's also very not forward-looking for your brand's long-term equity to not consider that and to shy away from these very important conversations around sustainability. The fact that some companies are drawing back on mentioning the word woman in their policies. So it's just very scary, but also so not in line with the data that we're seeing, that this is actually a huge commercial opportunity for brands too.
I was watching a YouTube video. It was the Chief Sustainability Officer for JP Morgan Chase globally. And she was talking about ESG investing. And she said that they've run models and they see absolutely no difference in long-term returns of ESG funds versus non-ESG funds. But the ESG funds have less downside risk. So what you're saying is that you get the same payoff for less risk. And only an investor that is literally insane would not take that bet. The trouble is there's these old paradigms like oil and gas and historical industries that aren't necessarily as transformed as they should be are safe bets. But the world has changed so much, and it is changing so fast at the moment, that real value can be left on the table unless you start looking for opportunities in sustainability and in inclusion. It makes absolutely no sense to exclude anyone from your market. Why would you do that?
And well, just to add on to that, why do you think that these important areas of sustainability should really be embedded in the strategy?
When you've been tracking something like the price of oil for a long time, it becomes predictable. And if you're in an oil producing country, you can literally influence the price of it. So we stick to what we know, we stick to what we can predict, we stick to what stories we think our investors will like to hear. But I see, more and more in this market, we'll start to see people that recognize that there is no future that isn't sustainable. It'll get more and more difficult to live and to create value. From a pure financial perspective, uncertainty destroys value. So when you're living in a market that's volatile, when you don't know what the weather's going to do, you don't know what your supply chain's going to be disrupted by next. You're living in a world of heightened uncertainty, and that's not good for investors. So there's a lot of momentum growing behind the space. I mean, Marina's in a far better position to discuss investor relations than I am. What are your thoughts on the subject?
For a long time, ESG analysis used to sit in-house within the same team, and they would rely on different tools to assess a company like Sustainalytics, MSCI, S&P, and so forth. But over time, they started feeling like they needed experts in these areas within their team. And I mean, I would sit through numerous calls where I will literally be grilled for hours on different sustainability topics because now they had experts in the team. We're actually seeing now a reversal of that where they're now going back to the old model. So it's going to be interesting to see whether is it all companies that are adopting that approach or which way it's going to go. But what helped in having the experts within the team is that the maturity of the conversation started to get better over time. So as an example, when I joined MTN, there were a lot of questions. Human rights is probably the topic that we get the most, by the way, in all calls when we sit with investors, just because of the nature of the type of markets we're in, but also how technology is evolving. It enables rights, but it also brings about additional risks. And you can imagine with the rise of AI, the questions are coming up around, ethical use of AI and so forth. But in the beginning, the conversations were, do you have a policy? Do you apply it? Now we're having conversations around AI. How is the countries regulating AI and so forth? So the maturity, they're no longer asking us fundamental questions. They're asking that. So I think they are starting to understand the sustainability issues a lot better. We're not getting a lot of G questions. It's now coming down to how does your board mature? How's the effectiveness or your board effectiveness policy, your gender representation of the board. Those are the kind of things that are coming up in the G. You're not getting those questions as much of, do you have a anti-corruption policy? No, So I find it's maturing over time, the conversations, but also their investment. So we see a lot of investors investing in MTN saying, we think you're a good business case and your sustainability is really good. So it's contributing. It is a contributing factor as well.
That's really cool to hear. I mean, it relates back to what you were saying earlier about the backsliding. And it made me think, if you're backsliding, you probably weren't there for the right reasons in the first place. Your why wasn't in place. And, if the conversation is maturing the way that you say it is, you're going to get more investors in more businesses for the right reasons than before. And that's going to be more sticky.
Will and Marina, I feel like the discussions that we've had here today are more befitting for a documentary. I'm devastated that we don't have enough time. Thank you so much for joining us today. But before I let you go, Marina, I want to pick your brain on what brand, in your opinion, other than MTN, because you're clearly doing amazing, what brand do you think is doing a really good job at communicating the sustainability message to consumers?
For a long time in the sustainability space, there were a few companies, and I won't mention them I know they're working hard on their reputation, but there were companies that were North Stars when we entered the sustainability space. I mean, I remember at one stage having a conversation with Mackenzie, speaking about the maturity journey, because that was really important for us when we started. We wanted to know, okay, what does good look like? So we would look at these companies as companies that were North Stars. And then over time, these are companies that have questioned their commitments. They've changed some of them and so forth. So I don't think we should look at North Stars anymore. I really feel like we need to look for brands that strive through actions and to really, those should be brands that we look up to. Brands that encourage us every day to take practical actions to be sustainable, you know? I mean, I'll mention one, Woolworths. Obviously, every time, like, I'm on my way to the shop, like, I know, okay, I better take my bag. If I've forgotten my bag, you know, it's really nice they've got that stand, and hopefully someone has left you one to share. You know, so I think that's what I look more for, is brands that give me the opportunity to daily take responsible steps to protecting the environment, to giving back to our communities, and so forth. That's what I look for in brands. And it's not one brand, it's different brands doing different things that will shift behavior, shift mindsets, and so forth.
It's so cool that you said Woolies, because we did an episode on social sustainability and inclusion and diversity with them. I love that you mentioned them. And that was not planned to our listeners. Will, before I round this off, I understand that our annual Sustainability Sector Index data, it will soon be available to our clients. Can you give us a little bit of a sneak peek of the sorts of insight we've extracted over 2024?
Well, I only looked at the report for the first time this morning, Sena, now that you're grilling me on data points. There was, so the top three issues, the main top issues is still poverty, lack of access to a job with a sufficient wage, and gender-based violence. So gender-based violence actually came up stronger this year than it has in previous years. And then access to water, access to clean, safe energy come in fourth and fifth. So, you know, what South Africans are looking for is still, you know, help me live a better life, help me support my family, help me live more sustainably ultimately. That means, you know, there are challenges for brands in that, because there's not a lot of wiggle room in the economy anymore. No one really has a lot of spare money to change, go and try something new. Changing behaviors is often difficult and comes with a bit of risk. So, you know, I guess the one thing that I would say as a result of, you know, just everything that we've discussed today and everything that's happening in the world, it's a great time to double down on your sustainability efforts. While everyone else is shrinking away, now's a good time to really stand up. And I would encourage any client that's keen to do that to come and chat to us.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Marina, and thank you, Will. This continues to be a really important conversation, so rest assured we'll continue to address different areas of sustainability on this podcast. But thank you to our listeners for tuning in. For more information, you can follow Kantar on LinkedIn and on X. We would love to hear from you, so please leave us a review and remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. Until next time.